Morozov is globally renowned for his criticism of big tech with its ideology of salvation, if you want to put it in religious terms, or more profanely, solutionism, as we refer to in his second book, To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. His first book, a little before that, followed a similar project, if you want to call it, strip techno-utopian rhetoric from its, utopianism, and see what's in store once that drug wears off. The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, published just about 10 years ago, I think. He writes for publications around the world, many syndicated texts also, and sometimes next year or so, a new book is expected to come out called Freedom as a Service. In the meantime, also check the website thesyllabus.com or Syllabus Tweets, an organic intellectual gatekeeping site, I would want to call it, and Twitter account founded by Yevgeny. In the website's own words, the good content is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Every day we find hundreds of stimulating new items from videos of conference talks to academic articles that are likely to get lost in the noise of social media, quote end. He himself certainly cannot get lost in any digital noise today because he's here in person to tell us more about his take on how Europe may become more democratic, sustainable, and fair through digital means, or not. Let's see. Here he is. Welcome, Yevgeny Morozov.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back. As you've heard, it's not for the first time that I have the honor of addressing this unique, I would actually argue, conference that has become a regular place for many of us like-minded people to discuss the challenges facing not just Europe, but I would argue social democracy as a project. And I think it's important that we actually situate ourselves politically and ideologically within that framework. I mean, we're in a very symbolic institution at a very interesting time. And I think whatever reflections we make upon digital and digital capitalism, I think we still explicitly or implicitly have to reflect upon what it means for social democracy in its future. And I will try to do that also in my remarks today. So I agree to a large extent with what Carlota Perez has been saying, especially about the exceptional nature of the moment we're in, both because of the climate catastrophe that we're facing and because of the post-COVID reconstruction efforts. I'm probably a bit more sanguine, if not entirely pessimistic, about the ways in which many of these efforts, both to fight the climate catastrophe and to accelerate the rebuilding of our economies after COVID, might actually result in the weakening of social democracy and in the entrenchment of an alternative project. And I think it's important that we engage with that possibility early on, because ultimately, from at least where I stand, social democracy is not by any means in a position right now to claim high ground when it comes to rebuilding our society or thinking through the climate challenge. And we've already seen that in the last 12 months or so with more and more power and more responsibility for what used to be the subject and matter of democratic politics delegated not just to big technology platforms, which is a trend I've documented probably over the last decade or so, but also to a growing host of consulting companies, to the point where in some countries, like Italy, for example, which is where I reside at the moment, a good chunk of the money that is supposed to arrive to help Italy rebuild its economy is managed by the consulting industry. And essentially we have to face it, that it's not our politicians and it's not our ministries that are implementing all of this rebuilding. It's a bunch of mostly American or European, well, to some extent, mostly American, actually, consulting entities. To some extent, it's, of course, also the rise of big, giant asset management firms, which are tasked now not only with thinking about how to make our economies greener and more sustainable, but also actually investing huge chunks of money that are directed to them from many of the institutions that we traditionally have associated with social democracy, including pension funds. And the consolidation of what some scholars have called asset management capitalism that we have seen in the last few years with massive growth in the balance sheets of firms like BlackRock or Vanguard and many others, to me points to the inability of many of us in the social democratic camp or the kind of leftist camp more broadly to actually understand these new powers and the ways in which they exercise power and the ways in which they constrain also what is possible. But beyond this kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, if you will, that I've just given you, I think we also have to understand that the emergence of this tech platforms, consulting companies, asset management firms, it also in some way entrenches the importance of the market as a central mechanism, not just for allocating goods, which is how traditionally we have thought about it, emerging, from the socialist calculation debate that stretched over the last almost 100 years, but also as a way of essentially problem solving, allowing people and institutions to engage in creative behavior, and as a way of discovering new practices, new facts, and new things about the world at large. And I would argue that if some of these trends continue, this role that is being attributed to the market as the primary vehicle of creative problem solving and as a mechanism for essentially discovering and institutionalizing the new, it will only get stronger and faster and more entrenched, which I would argue leaves social democracy in a very peculiar and problematic position, because its traditional defense of its own raison d'etre, if you will, was in arguing that we can actually think about better, perhaps more efficient and perhaps more just and more sustainable ways of distributing and allocating goods. And I think we haven't really engaged very well on the left side of the spectrum with understanding how we can build alternative infrastructures and alternative mechanisms, not just for allocating goods and services better than the market, but also for how can we actually enact creative problem solving or discovery or creativity stated even, at this level of abstraction. How do we actually build institutions that would not necessarily rely on the market and would nonetheless facilitate that and do that at scale? Right? And this is where I think the big ideational intellectual challenge facing the social democratic project in the next decades lies. It's in being able to imagine what it actually has to offer in thinking beyond the market form as a way of building these institutions for creative problem solving, discovery, and to some extent even becoming, and doing it at large, and by using information technology to actually facilitate all of that. So what I'm arguing here is that there is an urge that I see in forces of the left, whether they are social democratic or socialist, in reclaiming creativity and becoming and discovery as its core values. Those are not values that we should surrender to the kind of neoliberal entrepreneurial spirit of garage in Silicon Valley somewhere or in Palo Alto. Those, I would argue, are values that we in Europe have found how to build, institutionalize, and scale up. We've built institutions, both of the welfare state, but also many cultural institutions in the public sphere at large, that have done that very well, very often not relying on any market mechanisms whatsoever. And the big challenge facing us now is finding ways in which we can use digital technologies, use the fact that so much of our behavior now is transparent, analyzable. It's possible to build all sorts of network effects into that behavior once it's analyzed at scale. It's finding ways in which these infrastructures can actually be deployed to accelerate and scale up many of these processes. And thinking, of course, why that matters. Because if you talk to many people on the left today, they would not be able to tell you why that matters, because they would tell you that there are more pressing needs. We have to think about climate. We have to think about work. We have to think about unemployment. And, to some extent, I understand the pressing imperatives that many of these parties and political movements face. At the same time, I think we should try to take this longue durée kind of perspective and understand that, to some extent, the reason why the forces of the neoliberal right are winning is because they have managed to position the market not just as an institution for allocating goods, but also as an institution that facilitates discovery, becoming, and creative problem solving. And no matter how much big data we feed into our vastly improved platforms and mechanisms for central planning, it would still not deliver what we wanted to deliver. It might deliver a more efficient allocation of goods and services in the ideal world where everything will be powered by big data and all the algorithms will be working in order to optimize whatever planning decisions we need to make. It would still not suffice to resolve the problems that are currently being resolved at least, or they're claiming that they're resolving them at the level of, BlackRock or Silicon Valley or consulting firms in the realm of creativity, in the realm of creative problem solving, in the realm of discovery, right? And this is one part that no matter how much we try to accelerate and recover and rehabilitate central planning by means of big data, which occupies right now a lot of cognitive effort on the left, we would never get there. Because it's not about allocation, it's about something else. And this is where I think it's important for us to step outside even more and think about it a little bit even more philosophically and understand that traditionally, we on the left, we've made this fundamental distinction, which you see in Marx, which to some extent you see also in Hegel, you see it in subsequent thinkers, between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. Right? And we have traditionally thought that it's only by making sure that we take care of all the needs that emerge in the realm of necessity that we can eventually give people enough free time to pursue whatever creative projects they want in the realm of freedom. And of course, our initial assumption always was that without figuring out what those essential needs are, and without finding a way to resolve some of them by means of technology, digital technology, platform technology, you name it, we would never be able to arrive at the second stage, which is where true human creativity and freedom and becoming take place. And I think it's time for us to think whether that distinction that we've made within these two realms was actually a good one and whether it still makes sense in the context of digital technologies. The idea that it's by automating all of the processes that currently cater to our necessities and that satisfy our need for food or our need for sleep or our need for clean air, and putting all of our bets onto technologies that would automate that, to put it in a very popular term that received some circulation in the last few years, fully automated luxury communism, right? We would be able to fully automate all of these activities so that we then gain some free time for creativity and leisure. I think we have to think twice about whether this is actually something that we want. Not because somehow I'm critical or skeptical of automation, but for the sole reason that every time that we want to automate something, pursuing some kind of objective of efficiency, or thinking that, it will be the easiest or the cheapest or the most environmental way to do things, so we should just automate it and move on to something else. We will, of course, discover sooner or later a social group or a political group or an ethnic group or cultural group that is inevitably going to question just in whose interest this definition of efficiency was articulated and just whose interest it serves. And I would argue that, to some extent, many of these groups would be right. That the idea that we would be able to define efficiency as something eternally objective and transhistorical, and that we would be able to automate it and delegate it to technology and move on to something else, it's part of positivistic utopian science that we should have renounced back in the 19th century and not carry with us into the 21st. I don't have the full time to tell you what the proper at least in my view, analytical framework for thinking about these issues is. But I would argue that we can actually start by not drawing any separation between the two realms, whether it's the realm of necessity or the realm of freedom, but assume that all of our action happens in one realm, and that realm is the realm of creative action. And it just happens that, by and large, this is what a lot of neoliberal thinkers already think. They do think that we're all entrepreneurs, deep at heart, and they do think that there is a lot of creative action that we're all capable of, but they tend to believe that the only way in which you can scale up that creative action, with which all of us to some extent are pregnant or capable of, is by means of putting markets everywhere. It's by means of tying all of our action to what Hayek would call the cash nexus. There is absolutely no reason to believe that creative action that all of us are capable of, and sometimes we manage to manifest itself in our everyday life as we engage with each other and as we engage with artifacts. All of that can be easily scaled up by means of information technologies. All of that can be leveraged in order to generate network effects that have nothing to do with the market. That does not require intermediation by the logic of the market. It does not require intermediation by the logic of entrepreneurship. And the goal of social democracy on this reading is finding ways in which we can build robust social, public, digital infrastructures through which to leverage the fact that all of us, deep at heart, are creative entrepreneurs. But not entrepreneurs in the economic sense, but entrepreneurs in a sense that when we are facing a constraint that is new and genuinely unknown to us, we tend to invent new techniques and new forms of actions for essentially circumventing that problem. Right now, unfortunately, the way our society and digital economy works is that the only way in which we can circumvent it at scale is by finding a startup, attracting venture capital, and essentially building some kind of an app that in 99% of cases will fail. In 1% of cases, it might succeed, but that will already impose a certain developmental logic on the future of that idea. So regardless of what it is that we initially wanted to do, and regardless of how truly transformative our invention is, its only path towards mass market or towards mass use or mass adoption is by forcing itself into this, if you will, app form. And I would just argue that why on earth should we be limiting our potential and our innovative capacity in such a way? We should instead be aiming for a maximum number of institutional forms that these new ideas can take. They don't all have to become startups. They don't all have to become apps. There are all sorts of other ways and development paths that these new inventions that all of us make in our everyday life as we face the most mundane of problems, all of them can be to some extent institutionalized, scaled up, and shared with other people who run into the same or similar problems. But right now, the infrastructures, legal, economic, and technological ones for doing that are missing. And if social democracy finds a way in which to systematically and strategically to build those infrastructures, it will finally recover its raison d'etre, which will be positive, and which will be proactive. It will not just be reactive, as a means of responding to climate change or populism or something else. And it's towards this project of actually filling in social democracy with something that is proactive and that's something that's future-oriented and that argues that we can actually scale up creativity in ways much better than the neoliberals obsessed with the market, that I think the future of social democratic thinking lies. And once we unleash all of these potential institutional forms tied to everyday creativity of all of us, we would be able to have many more tools at our disposal for tackling problems like climate. Because in the current neoliberal conception of the world, where the market is the solution, through which all the creative action is supposed to be generated, it imposes a severe constraint on what kind of innovations are possible. And the only innovations that are possible are those that can, as I've said, fit into the market form to begin with. And it's the task of social democracy to make it possible that other kinds of innovations can actually appear, scale up, and be spread throughout society at large. So I know it's been a bit abstract. I mean, I'm formulating these ideas in the book that will come out next year. But I hope at least I've indicated that we can actually think more ambitiously, and I think we have no choice but to think more ambitiously given how likely it is that the current moment of both the post-pandemic build-up and recovery and the climate catastrophe will actually be used to solidify all these problems and the entrenchment of the consulting firms or the tech platforms or the big asset management firms. So we almost have no choice as people sympathetic to social democracy to think that ambitiously but also that abstractly. Thank you very much.